Hello, ancient history students. This is Mr. Doolittle. I just want to review some of the geography that we reviewed today in class, especially for some of you who weren't able to make it. Now, what we have here is a display of Europe. Europe along with many of its major river systems, and we'll just be looking at a few of those as well as places. So first of all, I want to focus on Italy. If we zoom in there on Italy, the two rivers that I'd like to have you know is, first of all, the Tiber River. You should remember the Tiber from the story of Romulus and Remus. The two twin boys were dropped off near the edge of the Tiber River, where they were discovered by the she-wolf, and then they later built the city of Rome. The other river of Italy that I want you to know is the Rubicon. Now, the Rubicon has not been prominent yet in Roman history, but it will become very important when we get to an episode related to Julius Caesar. And what ought to be known is that the Rubicon was treated more or less as the northern boundary of the Italian peninsula, so far as the Romans were concerned. Next, we looked at another river, the Danube, and the Danube is not a river that we're going to be focusing so much on, except it is good to know that this will function as the northern boundary for much of the Roman Empire later on. And I believe just by looking at it, it may in fact be the longest river of Europe. At least that's I didn't look it up, but that is how it appears to me. So that is the Danube River that I'd like you to know. Also, in the area that mostly encompasses modern-day France is what the ancient Romans referred to as Gaul. Now, Gaul was inhabited, logically enough, by individuals known as Gauls. They were also known as Celts, however. And if that term is familiar to you, you may be thinking of Celtic goods or Celtic culture that you may associate with Ireland, and that is because some Celts from Gaul at some point in ancient history migrated into the British Isles and further migrated into Ireland itself. And so nowadays when we think of the Celts, we think of Ireland. But the people of Gaul were broadly known as Celts to the Romans. Also, the Romans, after defeating Carthage in the Three Punic Wars, they took over Hispania. Hispania, which was under at least some Carthaginian domination, and of course that is the modern-day country of Spain. Looking further to the east, you ought to be well familiar with the Nile River from our Egyptian unit. And the Romans, this is where we get our name for Egypt. The Romans referred to it as Aegyptus. Aegyptus. Also familiar to you ought to be the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. From a previous unit, we discussed the once mighty Assyrian Empire, but after the Assyrians even after the Assyrians ceased being an empire, the region was still referred to as Assyria by many other peoples, and the Greeks simply dropped off the first two letters, and they referred to this region here as Syria, and the Romans took the name Syria from the Greeks. And of course, there is a country in the Middle East today, right there in that region, called Syria, and so that is how the Romans referred to it. Over in the region where Carthage once existed, the Romans took over the city of Carthage and the surrounding region and referred to it as their African province, or simply, so far as the Romans were concerned, they simply referred to it as Africa. Now, outside the region of their province was a kingdom called the Kingdom of Numidia. This will be important for the next segment in our review of Roman history, when we discuss the Jugurthine War. It's not something we've talked about yet in class, but just a heads up, the next thing in your notes, the new heading is going to be the Jugurthine War, and it will be concerned with a war Rome fought against the wannabe king of Numidia, whose name was Jugurtha. A couple more regions we'll talk about. Thracia, also known as Thrace in many textbooks and many writings. Now, Thracia is where the slave Spartacus is going to come from. He was a Thracian who was captured and sold into slavery. And he will, as we'll discuss in class, he will lead a massive slave revolt in Italy. And the slave revolt is going to attempt to cross out of Italy through the south and into Sicily. Now, Sicily is, of course, that deformed football or whatever the Italian boot is kicking. It's that island down to just to the south of Italy. And Spartacus is going to attempt to lead the slaves into Sicily, perhaps for safety, but as we'll see when we get to that story, he will be unable to. Sicily was also at one time dominated, in part at least, by the Carthaginians, and it was taken over by the Romans following. So that is a review of what we discussed in class today. Please feel free to pause and review the map as you see it. You should have a blank copy of the map that you are welcome to fill this in as you study it, being mindful of a quiz. So, have a good evening. See you next time.